Hi, welcome to our commercial advertising photography class. I'm glad you've joined us. DSLR is the most convenient and common equipment in commercial photography. Its fast and realistic imaging characteristics are one of the main reasons why it remains in great use in the camera family. By the concept of SLR, we mean single-lens reflex cameras. It is a method of framing in which the image passes through a lens and is reflected many times before reaching our eyes. There are also other types, such as twin-lens reflex and mirrorless. Now we will take a DSLR camera as an example to introduce its use in commercial photography. There are several important factors in the camera that affect the results of our photography directly, among which the aperture and shutter parameters are particularly important. Whether you are using continuous lighting, such as LED lights or triphosphor lights, or studio flash equipment, you need accurate aperture and shutter parameters to control the final brightness and effects of the images. Of course, there are limits to the aperture and shutter. For example, what size of the aperture is more appropriate? Or is it better to use a faster or slower shutter parameter? These issues need to be well considered before we shoot. Let's start with the setting of parameters. In the case of continuous lighting, under continuous light conditions, such as LED lights and triphosphor lights, the camera senses the intensity of light through the internal metering system and will automatically adjust to a pair of appropriate parameters quickly. In this case, we can choose the aperture priority mode and adjust settings according to the specific needs. For example, if we need the whole object to be clear, we can use a small aperture, like f11, f16, f22. If we need to have a certain depth of field bokeh effect in the foreground and background, we can set the aperture at a wide aperture, such as f4 and f5.6 in the shooting. Let's have a look into that through some examples. Through the comparison of pictures, we can see the difference of the object shot with different apertures. It is also important to note that for still life objects, in order to ensure clarity, we normally set the shutter at a 125th second or more. This can be adjusted by flicking the dial ring. If you use a tripod, you can set the shutter at about a 30th of a second, which can also ensure a certain degree of clarity. The aperture can then be adjusted in a wider range to suit specific needs. Under the illumination of flash lamp equipment, the aperture and shutter are set differently. Because the flash lamps adopt instantaneous flash illumination, the camera's internal metering system will not be able to predict the intensity of the light. It is necessary to use a light meter or other methods to more accurately determine the value of the light and fix it. We will explain the use of light meters in more detail later in the course. Therefore, if we use flash lamps, the camera needs to be set to manual mode to adjust the aperture and shutter values. During the setting process, we tend to fix the shutter value at a 125th seconds, while the aperture value can be set in advance according to the needed depth of field. For example, if we need a better bokeh in the picture, we can set the aperture to f5.6 and use a light meter to adjust the light intensity to 5.6. Then we are good to go. Now let's have a look at the use of flash lamps and their effects. That's it for the applications of aperture and shutter under different light conditions. In addition to aperture and shutter parameters, there's another parameter that will also affect the light, which is the ISO sensitivity. In commercial photography, to ensure the fine textures of the objects, we should set the ISO value as low as 100 to shoot. Only in the case of low light do we increase the ISO sensitivity. Additionally, we can also adjust the white balance parameter setting. Depending on the lighting conditions, the color of the image will vary with the color temperature. We can use the camera's white balance settings for accurate color reproduction. At an early stage of photography learning, we can set the white balance to automatic, which can basically meet the daily shooting of most products. When we get more skilled, we can choose the icon white balance settings. For example, we can set it to flash white balance under flash lamp lighting. As we get more and more professional, we can also set the color temperature value to the corresponding lighting to more accurately restore the color. For example, the color temperature value of flash lamps is generally in the range of 5,300 to 5,500. Of course, color temperatures of flash lamps from different brands are slightly different. To determine the accurate color temperature reproduction by white balance, you can use professional equipment such as color temperature meter for testing. These are some of the important parameters of DSLR cameras in commercial photography. Of course, there are many other features and parameters of the DSLR cameras that affect the final picture, which we will talk about later in the course.